What's up, beautiful image bearers? It's me, CA3, and today we're taking a look at Exodus 12, verses 14 through 20. So in this chapter, we see the institution of Passover as the Israelites are preparing to flee from Egypt. We kind of talked about this in a previous video, but we are continuing on taking a look at what Moses is teaching them in this moment, and we'll also take a look at some cross-references both in the Old and New Testament. So let's cover some history. It says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Passover began on the 10th. And on the 14th, they ate the Passover, and this was the first day of unleavened bread. Then for the next 7 days, they ate only unleavened bread. And so it says, so you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For on this day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. So for the first Passover, the unleavened bread was a practical necessity. They left Egypt in such a hurry that they didn't even have time to allow the dough to rise. And after the first Passover, the feast of unleavened bread was a testimony that was to be throughout the generations, as the text says. It says, for 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. And the thing about leaven is it was actually a picture of sin and corruption. In the same way that a little leaven influences a whole lump of dough, and also because of the way leaven can puff up the dough. This is the same way that pride and sin can ultimately make us feel puffed up. But significantly, God called them to walk unleavened after their initial deliverance from Egypt. Symbolically, they were being called to a life of moral purity before the Lord. So we see this idea, though, not only here in Exodus, but in other books of the Bible as well, talking about this idea of not only keeping the Passover, but as well looking out for the leaven. Taking a look at Ezekiel 45 and 21 through 25, we see this. You shall observe the Passover among the feasts celebrated at Ezekiel's future temple will be Passover, and God's redemption of Israel from Egypt and his greater redemption through the work of Jesus on the cross will always be remembered. But then moving on to Matthew 16 and 5 through 12. This is where we get a very clear picture directly from Jesus about exactly what this leaven represents. And so in these passages, Jesus is cautioning the disciples against false teaching. He says, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then the verses prior to verse 5, we actually see that Jesus has just had a conflict with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so now he uses this as a teachable moment to speak to his disciples about these signs and wonder issues and all of the issues with their theology and how they saw things. But once again, he goes to this metaphor of leaven. And so if you actually take a look at the parable of the leaven that Jesus talks about in Matthew 13 and 33, once again we see that leaven is used as a picture of sin and corruption. And so essentially this idea of leaven was the Jewish metaphorical expression for evil influence. So to the Jewish mind, leaven was always symbolic of evil. And the thing about it and why this particular metaphor is used is because leaven stood for not just an evil influence, but one that could spread throughout life and corrupt it. And that's the thing about false doctrine, as Jesus is here pointing out, is that it should be called leaven, because when you think about what it does, it sours the whole lump, it swells it up, it causes that to spread, and then it corrupts. And the thing is, it all happens secretly, because the nature of leaven is you don't necessarily realize what it's doing, but you can see the effects of it. So Jesus is trying to get this truth across to his disciples, and their response is, it is because we have taken no bread. And this was actually a very strange concern. If you look at these verses, Jesus reminds them that he had miraculously fed crowds exceeding 5,000 and 4,000 people. And so the disciples are not understanding that Jesus is using this as a metaphor. But after he has to call them out, he reminds them, it says, then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so Jesus is really pushing forth this idea of being careful with false teaching, especially in the name of religious hypocrisy. And so it's very interesting here, because what Jesus ultimately charges his disciples with are three things. First, ignorance. They didn't understand he was using physical things to illustrate spiritual principles. But then their unbelief. He calls out their faith. Here are the disciples overly concerned and worried about not having bread for the feast when Jesus had proven that he was able to provide anything they needed. And then forgetfulness. Apparently they had quickly forgotten what he had just done, and so therefore he had to remind them, you were with me when I did these things, remember? But finally we see Paul, even here in Galatians 5 and 7 through 12, talking about this idea of leaven as well. Paul says to the Galatians, you ran well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion does not come from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. And so Paul is encouraging them in a sense because he's like, look, you were on the right track. He's saying, look, you got off to a good start in the faith. But Paul also could see ahead and know that starting well isn't what matters, it's how you finish. So he says, who hindered you from obeying the truth? Paul knew that this false teaching, clearly came from a person and not from God. Definitely not from Jesus and the crucifixion that Paul was preaching. And that's why he says this persuasion does not come from him who calls you. And so at the root of it all, the real issue here is that the Galatians were leaving Jesus to pursue the false and empty teachings of man, and in this case, legalism. And so when we look at this word for hindered, what it actually means in the Greek is it's kind of a metaphor of dealing with, military operations or wartime or battle. And so what the word signifies is to break up a road. And by doing so, you make that road impassable, and therefore it's clearly the opposite of clearing the way for someone. And so basically what Paul here is saying is that the Galatians were doing well in the faith until they allowed somebody to break up the road that they were traveling on spiritually. And so yet again, we see this idea, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Once again, we have Paul now in the New Testament driving home this point that, the corruption and the influence of legalism and other doctrines that ultimately diminish Jesus and what he did on the cross, they're like leaven in a lump of dough. But the scary thing is that a little bit soon will corrupt the whole lump. So Paul is making it clear that this legalistic commitment that they have right now, it may be small, but it is so dangerous that it can corrupt everything. So what's the point of all this, right? We have to know the word, okay? And when you know the word, you can stand against man-made lies and traditions that contradict it and thereby hinder your walk with Christ, who has purchased your freedom. He didn't purchase freedom for us to sin or live any way that we choose. He did purchase the freedom for us in the sense that we are free from the demands of the law, from the 10 Commandments, the law we could never actually meet in the first place. The whole reason we needed Jesus. And so please be careful. When you know your word, you can tell when somebody's even taking the smallest thing out of context or twisting it in a way that scripture does not support. And so while it may seem harmless to believe small inconsistencies and lies here and there, it starts with the small things before it ripples throughout the entire thing. And next thing you know, your foundation of truth is broken. And so keep in mind, God's commands are not to restrict us, but to free us to live holy lives as he intended. And all of this is possible, as I said, because of Jesus Christ, our Passover lamb who bore the sins of all mankind on the cross. Praise be unto God. That's all I got for you today. God bless, peace, and I love you.